Hey friends, back with holes again. So as we left off, Stanley had run away also to go after Zero. He found Zero underneath a boat, which happened to belong to Sam, called the Mary Lou. Do you remember who Mary Lou was? She's the donkey, or the mule. And somebody made a comment on one of the posts that I had that said they really liked the way the story was all coming together. Well, that's kind of what's fun about storytelling, right? The author thinks of different pieces of the story. So he had a story about Kate Barlow and Sam, and then he had a story about Stanley, and then he had the story about the Zeronis and Stanley's great-great-grandfather, how he stole the pig. And now it's all coming together. That's good storytelling, and that's what makes it really fun. So let's see what happens next. They put, and the last thing is they were drinking 100-year-old spiced peaches. Sounds kind of gross. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack and Zero held the shovel. Sorry. I should warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. Well, when you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day, and Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. Remember, he forgot to fill it up? That would have been a really good idea to fill the canteen up before he walked into the desert. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach and he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. Think about it. It might have tasted good, just moisture-wise, but 100-year-old peaches, I would think they'd have some pretty funky bacteria in there. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs-up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, and then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And they never reached it, he realized. Then they'd still have to climb it. Oh, and if they ever did reach it, he realized they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she once was a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting in the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I've got to stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. Hey, we're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground, and Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need it to dig a grave, Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up once again, flashing the thumbs-up sign. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a second to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out for himself. Run, run, run! Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it did seem a little closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry and he was weak and exhausted. Yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought, he hoped, that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe that bacteria were only on the jars which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death he would feel too weak to feel any pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought that his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it was like for his mother and father day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. Isn't that terrible? I forgot to remind you of that. So they got rid of all Zero's files, basically saying he was never here and never existed, and just pretending like he just wasn't a person, which is terrible. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she'd tell them, and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of Big Thumb. Probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed a laugh. "Well, I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they'd been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb out of it. They could no longer see the Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked up the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support, in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside of him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs-up sign, and Stanley did the same. He looked above him, and he wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above him, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Sure I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself up onto the ledge. God, I hope they don't fall. That'd be terrible. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed a hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down toward Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another thing for Zero to try to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel, and as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him, his hands moved one over the other, up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp on his wrist. He had let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall with Zero's help and pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. He took a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He had held onto the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack, and they decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on top of Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now they really were almost there. It scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground just got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid that they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try to swat at them. "Hey, how you doing?" Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, "If a gnat lands on me, it'll knock me over." Stanley gave him some more words. "B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard, then said, "Boogs." Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end." "Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Suddenly Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Sorry about that. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. "Weeds and bugs," he said. "There's got to be water around here someplace. We must be getting close." A wide, clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed a thumbs up again, and then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs, weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on it one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself and also seemed to come from outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a giant magnet pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was like the bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by occasional rainstorm like the ones he had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him, and Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled onto the small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. Had he come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed to be the muddiest. The ground became gloppier. The mud splashed as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers and then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was almost as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching out the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped more water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hands came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped off the dirt and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst inside his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes, and then he swallowed. He felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate He only ate half, and he gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." "What is it?" Zero whispered, or said. Sorry. "A hot fudge sundae." Sorry, at the end there I was messing up. So, do you remember in the earlier story, Sam had a bunch of onions? So now we know where he got the onions. And he told Zero it was a hot fudge sundae. So, really, we're so close to the end. I'm not sure. I might just read the next time and then be finished with it. Gosh, I love this story. It's so good. And I kind of know what happens, but I haven't read it in so long I kind of forgot. So we'll be reading it together. All right, friends, happy reading.